This is a zombie. This is a good spaghetti sauce. Both of these can determine whether or not you are successful over the long term in your business development strategies. We'll get back to the zombies in a minute. First, let's talk sauce. You understand by now that everything we discuss here at the Pursuit Coach depends on one thing, and that's lead time for success over the long run. Individual ingredients are all mixed together to create a spaghetti sauce, and your pursuits are no different. However, while all the ingredients are typically the same, we all know not all spaghetti sauces are equal. To describe how all this fits together, I've developed what I call the business development spaghetti sauce principle. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. First up is the sauce that I call Mom, I've got practice in an hour sauce. This is where you crack a jar, pour it into a pot, heat it over the stove. It looks red, it tastes like tomatoes, it looks like tomato sauce, but we all know it's really just an emergency cover. The next is what I call Mrs. Leone's Saturday sauce. This is the sauce that Mrs. Leone down the street would make every Saturday without fail. She'd start to buy the fresh ingredients on Thursday, she'd start chopping and mixing on Friday, and on Saturday morning she'd put that big pot over a low simmer on the stove and let it cook and blend throughout the day. This is the sauce that by Saturday afternoon you were trying to find ways and excuses to make sure you were at the Leone's house for dinner that night. The third is Grandma Maggio's Perpetual Sauce. This is the pot of sauce that always seemed to be on the stove just in case someone stopped by. It was always there, it was always just the right temperature, and Grandma Maggio always seems to add just the right ingredients that everybody likes. Everyone looked forward to it, and it was always there. With those in mind, I've got questions for you. First, which pursuit sauce are you cooking? And second, how do you beat Grandma Maggio's sauce? Let's take a look. Here's what the business development spaghetti sauce principle looks like. The graph compares the timing, duration, and intensity of your business development efforts with a client. Let's look first at the green line that is labeled pop-up. This is the Mom, I've got practice in an hour sauce. This reflects no interaction with the client prior to the issuance of the RFP. Then, the intensity and duration of our activities is as high as there is time for or the client will allow. The result? Something that on the surface looks like a pursuit, but really has very little thought, flavor, or substance to it. And probably 90% of the time, it's a loser. Next is the new strategic client sauce. This is the Mrs. Leone sauce. Here, you're starting from scratch, but you're doing so with a long lead time ahead of the RFP to allow your staff and that of the client to really come together and blend. This is where your new clients are created. The relative intensity of your efforts is the same as the incumbent, if there is an incumbent. You're just at a disadvantage here because you're starting from a lower position, as shown here on the graph. Next is the incumbent sauce, or Grandma Maggio's sauce. This is where your efforts, if you're the incumbent, have a greater intensity for the same level as effort as the competition because you are already integrated and influential with the client. You already know where to apply your efforts for maximum effect. Your efforts are always there on a low simmer and in position for the next project. Now, let's talk zombies. This is a zombie. And this blue line also represents a zombie. This is a client you have not cultivated. Not only was the RFP a pop-up, but because it is in the firm's area of technical expertise, no one within the office would kill it. Therefore, it becomes a zombie, an undead RFP. It wanders from meeting to meeting, office to office, until right before the deadline, it finds a victim that is willing to write a proposal which proceeds to eat up the time and resources of your staff and has no positive outcome to it. Zombies grow from surprise RFPs. They feed on desperation, idle time, and temptation. What should you do with a zombie? Kill it. They should be killed on site to save the office. Let's take a look at the approaches in a little more detail and talk about dethroning Grandma Maggio and her perpetual sauce. The first thing I want to look at is the starting point. Pop-ups and zombies result when the client isn't being shown any attention, and as a result, the intensity of effort through the rapport zone is even below the baseline, as the green and blue line shows. The difference between the curves for the new client and that of the incumbent is determined only by the starting point, since the incumbent is already established with the client. If an incumbent maintains this effort at the top of the curve, they can be very difficult to beat. If you are the incumbent, that's great news. If you're not the incumbent, you need to know this, because if it's obvious through your communications with the client that the incumbent is accomplishing this, they could be very difficult to beat, and you may be best served to walk away so that you can fight another day. The dotted line is where change occurs. This dotted line represents when the incumbent falters. As the incumbent curve approaches the new client curve, being us in this case, it represents growing opportunity. When the curve drops below the red line, this is the opportunity zone. And your best opportunity to gain work with the new client, as the client begins to think, maybe it's time to make a change. When you hear that from a client, or any hesitation in their voice about the incumbent, that means that the incumbent curve has dropped below your level of effort, and there's an opportunity zone there. When you do your work with the client in the rapport zone, when there's less competitive background noise, the less interaction you need to have in the proposal zone, as the illustration shows, when losing competitors are making a ruckus and taking up the client's time. The last thing I want to talk about is the detrimental effects of a pop-up and zombie on your future efforts. A savvy client has a good idea of the competition before the RFP is ever issued. Those firms that show up for the first time after the RFP is issued are either one, an inconvenience and time suck for the client, or two, they're less informed, or even worse, uninformed, and the proposal will reflect that, resulting in the client having to review proposals that aren't well thought out and simply disrespectful of the client's time. In my opinion, when a project is chased from the position of a pop-up or a zombie, the result is the status of the firm with the client actually drops below the baseline. that reputation has been damaged in the eyes of the client. So that firm not only has to come up in the future, they actually have a hole to dig themselves out of. As you look down the road to your business development strategic pursuits, identify your Grandma Maggio and your Mrs. Leone clients, and get those pots of sauce onto the stove as quickly as you can. Forget about sauce from a jar. That's not going to satisfy anyone at the client or within the firm. And for your own good, identify all zombies and report them to the zombie extermination team as soon as possible and get them out of the office. Next, we're going to look at the client staff analysis tool and make sure that you know who's sitting around the table for that upcoming spaghetti dinner. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the dining room. So long.